This podcast in our basic genetics series is going to deal with sex-linked inheritance. When we think about sex-linked inheritance, we're generally thinking about genes that are on the X chromosome. We do know that there are some genes on the Y chromosome. The OMIM lists 66 genes on the Y chromosome. Most of what we consider in relation to sex-linked inheritance deals with X-linked recessive traits. We will spend a few minutes, though, talking about sex-linked dominant traits on the X chromosome as well. So several common X-linked recessive diseases or traits. We know of diseases like hemophilia A, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, red-green color blindness. So the inheritance pattern and recurrence risks for X-linked recessive conditions differs substantially from those caused by autosomal genes. A normal female contains 2 copies of the X chromosome. If you're talking about an X-linked recessive disease, an individual could be homozygous for the disease-causing gene at a given locus. She could be heterozygous for the disease-causing gene. In other words, one disease-causing gene and one normal allele, so a mutated X and a normal X. Or she could be homozygous for the normal alleles on the X chromosome. So you could say that X-linked loci for females behave like autosomal loci, but in any somatic cell there is only one functional copy because of X chromosome inactivation. So half of the cells in a heterozygous female are going to express the disease allele and half are going to express the normal allele. We generally think that X-linked recessive genes, I say in quotes, are only seen in males. That's not absolutely true, but in general they tend to be more common in males. So you have an XX heterozygous female for an X-linked disorder. She's usually going to have a normal phenotype with about 50% of the normal gene product. And that's because of X chromosome inactivation. An XY male could be normal. He would be hemizygous for the X chromosome. If the male inherits a recessive disease gene on the X chromosome, he is going to absolutely be affected by the disease because he only has one X chromosome. So you could think about this, an X-linked recessive disease gene frequency we can say is Q. The frequency of males with an X-linked recessive disease gene is also Q. In this case, the gene or allele frequency would equal the genotype frequency because a male with only one X chromosome is going to manifest the disease if the X chromosome contains the disease-causing mutation. Females with X-linked recessive disease, as you could say, would be Q square. That would behave as though it were an autosomal recessive condition, as you would think about a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So think about this. Hemophilia A, it's X-linked recessive. It occurs in about 1 out of 10,000 males. So Q is 0.0001. Q square is very rare, and indeed you only see 1 in 100 million females that have hemophilia A. The characteristics of X-linked recessive inheritance are seen by the pedigree. Once again, the solid symbols are affected individuals. The dotted symbols are heterozygous carriers. X-linked recessive inheritance is usually seen more frequently in males. There is no father-to-son transmission. It appears to skip generations when it's passed through female carriers, and heterozygous females are usually clinically normal. This is because of X chromosome inactivation. Risk assessment for X-linked recessive disorders. In this Punnett square example, we'll assume the X chromosome carries the mutation for the X-linked recessive disease. So you've got a carrier mother marrying a normal male. The mother will transmit the disease gene to half of her sons and to half of her daughters. You can see that very easily by working the Punnett square. These are probability estimates for the children. So half her daughters are going to be carriers, half are going to be normal, half her sons are going to be normal, and half her sons are going to have the disease. Why are these probability estimates? Remember, these are probability estimates because every pregnancy is an independent event. Let's take this situation where an affected male, here showing the X sub 2, mates with a homozygous unaffected female, shown like that. These are exact numbers for children because the father will only transmit the Y chromosome to sons and the X chromosome to daughters. So all this man's sons are going to be normal. All the daughters must be heterozygous carriers. So let's look at risk assessment for X-linked recessive disorders. You have a carrier female mating with an affected male. So we represent the carrier female here. Here's the X-linked with the little r recessive disorder. So this is a carrier female. She's mating with an affected male. It would show that 50% of the daughters are going to have the disorder. 50% of the daughters are going to be normal. Likewise, 50% of the sons are going to have the disorder. 50% of the sons are going to be normal. Now, of course, of these daughters that are normal, they would be carriers. In this situation, why does it appear as though there was father-to-son transmission in an X-linked disorder? Well, it appears that way because the affected father married a carrier mother. What if you have an affected female? Females generally are rare that are affected with an X-linked disorder. So the above example here is a little bit of a concocted example. But so you have an affected female mates with a normal male. So we show her like this with the two little R's for the X chromosome with a normal male. All of her daughters are going to be carriers and all of her sons are going to be affected. This shows the inheritance pattern of X-linked recessive disorder. So a normal mother marries an affected father. The girls are going to be carriers, the boys are going to be normal. A carrier mother mates with a normal father. You're going to have half the boys are going to be affected, half are going to be normal, half the girls are going to be carriers, and half are going to be normal. What about X-linked dominant conditions? There are fewer known X-linked dominant conditions. They're less prevalent than X-linked recessive conditions. You'll generally find twice as many females affected with X-linked dominant conditions unless the condition is lethal in males. Now, the severity of the disease in females will vary, again because of X inactivation, but if it's a dominant condition, you only need inherent one copy of an X-linked dominant gene for the disease to be manifest, so much like an autosomal dominant condition. All affected fathers cannot transmit the disease to sons because they can only transmit a Y chromosome to sons. Skipped generations are not common. Affected females are usually heterozygous with a 50% chance of passing the disease allele to their sons and daughters. This shows an affected mother with an X-linked dominant condition mating with a normal father. 50% of her sons are affected. 50% of her sons are normal. 50% of her daughters are normal. 50% of her daughters are mildly affected. Here's an affected father mating with a normal mother. 100% of the sons are normal. 100% of the daughters are mildly affected. And again, why are they mildly affected? It's because of X chromosome inactivation. So this chart just shows the inheritance pattern for X-linked dominant conditions. So a normal mother with an affected father, you're going to have normal sons and mildly affected girls. On the other hand, an affected mother with a normal father, you're going to have affected sons, normal sons, mildly affected girls because of random X chromosome inactivation, and normal girls. And so this is important to understand. The girls are mildly affected in the X-linked dominant conditions because of X chromosome inactivation. You're going to randomly inactivate X chromosomes, and so you're inactivating some of the X chromosomes that contain that dominant mutation. What type of inheritance does this pedigree suggest? You're just showing inheritance to males, male to male to male to male. So you'd think this is Y-linked. The transmission is exclusively male to male. But you need to be careful. Could this represent something else? It's a fairly large family, but it's still not that large. 3 children happens to be 2 affected males and unaffected girl. 3 children, 2 affected males, 2 children, an affected male. You have to be careful. This might represent a dominant mutation. You have to always consider family size and clinical information when deciding what pattern of inheritance a pedigree represents. Remember, Y-linked inheritance is very rare. There are only 60 mutations associated with the Y chromosome. So although I want you to know about Y-linked inheritance, we're not likely to test you on that in our course.